You are curious, and rightly so, about why men often return after you have moved on. It is a question that sits at the intersection of psychology, mythology, and the most pragmatic elements of human behavior. It is not merely about romantic failure or about games. It is about meaning, identity, and the distribution of value within relationships. When someone leaves, there is a peculiar disturbance, something that was fixed in place, however precariously, has been displaced. And when that happens, the mind does what minds do. It reassesses, it recalibrates, it searches for a new map to bring order back to the territory. The return is often less about the other person than it is about the returning person's confrontation with their own disorder, and the realization that the cost of that disorder was greater than they were willing to admit. We must begin with a simple truth that is always worth repeating. Human beings crave meaning through responsibility. Responsibility is stabilizing. It structures the individual's life so that chaos does not accumulate. When a relationship dissolves, a sphere of responsibility evaporates. The man who once had a role, protector, partner, contributor, suddenly perceives an absence where there had been purpose. The absence is not empty. It possesses a shape, an outline carved by memory and habit. When you move on, you close a chapter, you remove the scaffolding that allowed the other person to hang their identity on you. That removal forces a confrontation. To some, that confrontation reveals that they were not as individuated as they thought. They discover the extent to which they outsourced their meaning to the presence of someone else. The shock of that realization is a powerful motive for return. But motives are messy, layered. There is the primitive layer, attachment. Attachment is ancient and biological. It is the neural architecture that kept small mammals close to their caregivers, ensuring survival. These circuits do not simply switch off because someone leaves or because reason dictates that leaving was for the best. The brain's chemistry holds on. Dopamine remembers reward patterns. Oxytocin remembers trust and tactile familiarity. So, on a neurochemical level, the returning behavior is rooted in a yearning for the familiar architecture of safety and reward. But the story does not end with biology. There is another layer, narrative identity, which is equally potent. Humans construct stories about themselves, who they were, who they are, who they might be. A relationship becomes part of that story, a thread woven through the fabric of life. When you move on, that thread is cut. Suddenly, the narrative no longer makes sense. Men who have not developed a robust alternative narrative, one that centers responsibility, purposeful competence, and integrated value, will often attempt to stitch that thread back into place by returning to its source. This is not merely sentimental. It is an attempt to repair the continuity of self. Consider also pride, which is a strange and complicated guardian of the self. Pride can protect a man from shame, but it can also blind him to the fact that he was the architect of his own loss. When someone departs, pride pushes back. It rationalizes, it justifies, it pretends that the loss is the other person's mistake. Yet pride cannot live long with the gnawing question of whether the fault is in fact internal. To return is sometimes to negotiate with that pride, to test it, to see whether it will hold. When faced with the evidence of loss, a man might come back because he wishes to reclaim his dignity by demonstrating that he can be better, that he can repair what he broke. This is not noble by default, but it is a form of moral reckoning, albeit one initiated by wounded self-regard. Then there is the dynamic of scarcity and value. People evaluate relationships through a market-like mechanism, not purely economic, but psychological. Value is often perceived in the light of availability. When you are easily available, your perceived value diminishes in the eyes of someone who equates possession with certainty. When you move on, availability shifts. Suddenly you are not an endless resource. Scarcity, paradoxically, enhances perceived worth. A man who always had someone at his side may have taken that presence for granted. When that presence withdraws, the mirror that once reflected his worth no longer hangs on the wall. He sees himself differently without your reflection and realizes that his previous estimate of his own life was impoverished. The decision to return can be the moment he adjusts that estimate. We must not romanticize the return. It can be manipulative, cowardly, or self-serving. Some men return out of convenience to fill an immediate void without any intention of long-term change. This is why discernment is necessary. When a man returns, it is vital to read the architecture of his return. Is he offering responsibility or merely seeking warmth? Is he bringing forward real change, or is he asking you to resume carrying the burden you had to lift to free yourself? The return should be treated as evidence, not as an event that automatically restores the prior covenant. It is data. It tells you about his capacity for reflection, humility, and transformation. If the return is accompanied by a pattern of the same irresponsible behaviors, it is likely a ritual repetition rather than a genuine correction. There's a deeper symbolic layer here that many neglect. In myths and religious stories, the hero often goes forth and loses a companion only to return transformed, or to find that the loss itself was the test that enabled maturation. The loss forces a confrontation with the shadow, that part of the self that is unintegrated, resentful, impulsive, or cowardly. To return after you move on is sometimes the first sign of the individual's encounter with his shadow. It is a sign that the neglected parts of his character are surfacing and demanding attention. Will he reconcile with those parts, take responsibility for them, and turn them into competence? Or will he externalize them, projecting blame onto you or onto circumstances? The answer to that question determines whether his return is the seed of a new relationship founded on growth, or merely the recurrence of an old, rotten pattern. I want to speak frankly about temptation and the societal scripts that shape masculine behavior. Men are taught, often tacitly, that pursuit equals value. The chase confers a psychological reward. The conquest narrative is embedded in cultural stories. When the chase ends, and especially when the pursued moves on, there can be a crisis of purpose. Men who have been socialized to equate worth with conquest will experience the loss as a failure of competence. The return, then, can be a last-ditch attempt to reclaim that competence. But competence without character is hollow. The necessary alternative is to develop competence that serves responsibility, competence in being honest, competent in listening, competent in providing stability. If the returning man is willing to exchange the chase narrative for a narrative of custodial competence, then the return has the potential to be transformative. There is also the matter of timing and maturation. People grow unevenly. The man who walked away yesterday might be different 6 months from now. Sometimes distance breeds clarity. When you move on, you create space for the other person to experience the life that arises without you. In that space, they might confront the consequences of choices they previously rationalized away. This is why the act of moving on can be a form of corrective punishment, not vindictive, but instructive. It shows the person the value they once ignored. If they are capable of reflection, they will see the void their absence produced and possibly begin the arduous work of self-reform. The return, in that case, is a symptomatic of real change. It is like watching a sculptor step back from his work and recognize that the piece is incomplete. He returns to the bench with new humility. Yet, one should not mistake return for victory. Returning does not automatically mean success in love or maturity. The real test that follows is sustained improvement. If you accept someone back, you must watch whether they maintain new habits over time. Do they take on responsibilities they previously avoided? Do they speak truthfully about their failures? Do they solicit feedback and respond to it without defensiveness? Do they stop expecting you to absorb the consequences of their decisions? These are the metrics by which genuine change can be evaluated. If the man only returns when loneliness presses and retreats when life becomes demanding again, he has not been reconstituted. He has merely engaged in a cycle driven by convenience. It is also important to acknowledge the role of boundaries in this entire dynamic. Boundaries are not punitive. They are logos made concrete, an externalization of internal order. Moving on is the embodiment of a boundary. The clarity of that boundary teaches. It communicates that your life is governed by principles, not by the emotional tides of whoever drifts in and out. When a man recognizes that your boundary is grounded in principle rather than whim, he understands that winning you back requires him to change in ways that outpace simple seduction. He must align his life to those principles. Boundaries compel the other person to climb toward you rather than drag you down to where they are comfortable lingering. We must also consider the humility that returns can require. To genuinely come back is to admit error. That admission is not easy because it opens one to shame. The capacity to experience shame and not be destroyed by it is central to psychological maturity. Shame can function adaptively when it leads to corrective action rather than to avoidance. A man who returns with clear admission of error, coupled with palpable plans for change and a track record to match, is demonstrating a vulnerability that is the foundation for trust. Trust is rebuilt not by words, but by consistent action. Therefore, the wiser course for anyone considering reconciliation is to demand evidence small, consistent acts of integrity accumulated over time. Finally, one must not forget that moving on is also an act of self-authoring. It is the declaration that you will not be defined by someone else's indecision or failure. In making such a decision, you reorient your life toward the competence that you deserve. If a man returns in a way that invites you to re-enter a life of compromise, you must weigh the logical and emotional consequences. If his return catalyzes your own further development, if it challenges you to become clearer about your standards and values, then it may serve as an accelerant to your own growth. If it invites regression into old dynamics where your needs are deprioritized, then it threatens the very progress that justified your leaving. There are therefore multiple reasons men come back: biological attachment, disrupted narrative identity, wounded pride, perceived scarcity, the encounter with the shadow, cultural scripts about pursuit, the possibility of maturation, the pressure of boundaries, and the humble necessity of admitting error. Each return carries within it a test for him, for you, and for the relationship itself. The prudent response is neither blind acceptance nor reflexive rejection. It is careful appraisal of the moral architecture of the person returning. Ask not only what he says, but what he does. Demand that his actions align with the responsibilities he claims to accept. In the absence of such alignment, the return will likely be a cyclical echo rather than a genuine transformation. As you listen to a returning voice, remember to listen to the quiet voice inside you that knows the patterns you cannot afford to ignore. You have already proven your capacity for courage by moving on. Do not squander that courage by conflating loneliness with love or familiarity with virtue. If he returns changed, welcome the growth, but keep your standards. If he returns unchanged, let your move on stand as the boundary that teaches better than words can. Above all, remember that the most reliable predictor of a man's future behavior is his past behavior, unless he shows deliberate, public, and sustained evidence to the contrary, and that evidence, when it appears, must be measured over time, not in a single dramatic confession. If you choose to welcome him back, structure the terms so that they favor the development of character and responsibility, require transparency, demand accountability, and set clear expectations for shared labor and mutual respect. If he balks, understand that change was perhaps never his true intention. If he complies and grows, you have both been given the chance to form a relationship with stronger bones. The story then becomes one of two individuals who, having confronted their own weaknesses and restructured their lives around higher values, attempt anew to create something durable. If this occurs, it will not be because of mere chemistry or convenience, but because both parties have chosen to build brick by careful brick, a life in which the responsibilities they carry give meaning to the freedom they enjoy. Notice, finally, that the logic of return points us to the universal requirement that any human relationship worth sustaining must be grounded in the discipline of truth, telling, the courage to accept responsibility, and the humility to change. Without those elements, returns will be hollow and repetitive. With them, a return can be the first honest step on the road to a partnership that is not merely comfortable, but ennobling. And yet, the deeper truth behind why men come back after you move on is not only about the man himself, it is about the universal human fear of irrelevance. To be forgotten, to become a ghost in the life of someone who once knew you intimately, is a form of existential death. People are terrified of that. When you truly move on, when you stop checking their messages, stop hoping, stop leaving the door slightly ajar, something powerful happens. You communicate silently but unmistakably that their access to your world is no longer guaranteed. That reality, the finality of being replaced, stirs something primal within them. It is not only the loss of love that hurts, it is the realization that they are no longer significant in the narrative they once dominated. The ego cannot easily tolerate that form of erasure. And so many return not out of genuine love, but to reclaim the validation of still being remembered. When a man sees that you have rebuilt yourself, that you no longer orbit around his absence, it confronts him with the consequences of his choices. He begins to see what you have become without him, more composed, more radiant, more self-sufficient. That growth acts as a mirror, one he cannot escape. It reflects everything he could have been had he not walked away. And people do not like mirrors that expose their inadequacy. They prefer to return and repaint the image to regain control of the reflection. But by then, something irreversible has occurred. You have become someone different, someone who no longer needs their validation to feel whole. And that shift in power dynamics, subtle as it may seem, is the real reason they come back. They sense it. They feel it in the silence between your words, in the calm certainty in your eyes. It's worth understanding that relationships often collapse because of asymmetry. One person gives too much while the other remains passive, entitled, or complacent. When you finally withdraw your energy, you restore equilibrium. You remind the world and him that your love is not a charity. It has value. It requires reciprocity. It demands responsibility. This is not cruelty. It is justice. And when justice enters the emotional equation, people awaken. The same man who once ignored your presence now feels your absence like an ache. The messages you used to send go unanswered in his memory. Now he stares at his phone, waiting for a notification that will never come. That quiet reversal is often the moment of awakening, not because he has discovered something new about you, but because he has discovered something missing within himself. Men, especially those who have not matured emotionally, often require distance to understand intimacy. They must lose the warmth before they understand its source. They must stand in the cold to recognize that what they once dismissed as ordinary was in truth rare. Some people only learn the value of stability when confronted with chaos. They only learn the beauty of peace after the storm. When you move on, you give him the opportunity to face that chaos alone. You are no longer the one who regulates his emotions, smooths over his insecurities, or absorbs his instability. The silence becomes his teacher, and silence, though painful, is often more instructive than argument. Now, some will come back because they are genuinely transformed. They have faced their shadow, endured their mistakes, and grown into someone capable of sustaining a relationship built on mutual respect. Others, however, will come back simply because you represent comfort, an old pattern they can fall into when life becomes unbearable. The difference between the two lies not in what they say, but in what they do consistently over time. The first kind of man will return with humility. He will speak less of promises and more of actions. He will take accountability for the pain he caused without shifting blame. The second will return with grand words, nostalgia, and urgency. He will speak of the past to avoid confronting the future. He wants familiarity, not growth. It is crucial that you discern between the two, for one brings healing, the other brings repetition. When you have moved on, you are no longer operating from longing, you are operating from clarity. That is why your energy feels different. You do not chase. You do not explain. You do not plead. You exist grounded and whole, and that energy is magnetic. It draws attention not because it seeks approval, but because it radiates certainty. A man who once felt superior to your vulnerability now finds himself drawn to your self-containment. What he once interpreted as neediness, he now recognizes as depth. But by then, the lesson is his to bear. The strength he now admires is the strength he once neglected. The irony is that true power in relationships rarely comes from control. It comes from detachment, not emotional indifference, but spiritual equilibrium. When you detach, you are not cold, you are wise. You understand that love must flow freely, not be extracted through persuasion or sacrifice. You understand that anyone worthy of your presence will recognize its worth without needing to lose it first. But for those who lack that awareness, loss becomes the only teacher they respect. When you move on, you become that teacher, not through lectures, but through silence. You embody the truth that nothing grows where boundaries are absent. He returns, perhaps with apologies. He says he has changed. And maybe he believes he has, but change is not a declaration. It is discipline. Real change manifests in consistency, not intensity. It's in how he manages conflict, how he listens when you speak, how he handles your silence without collapsing into self-pity. Most men who come back are in love with the memory of you, not the responsibility of being with you. They love the comfort of nostalgia, not the challenge of growth. And that distinction is where many fall again. They accept apologies instead of transformation, words instead of accountability. You must remember the power of moving on is not in punishing anyone, but in healing yourself so deeply that you no longer need validation from those who once dismissed you. That independence terrifies the unhealed man because it means he no longer controls your emotional weather. His storms no longer sway your peace. You have become the calm after the chaos, and he feels the imbalance. That imbalance calls him back, not because he suddenly values you more, but because he cannot stand to see someone else benefit from what he wasted. Every person who has ever walked away from something good eventually faces this reckoning. They see that time does not pause for regret. They see that you did not collapse in their absence, but rather evolved. You started reading again, smiling again, dreaming again. You replaced their chaos with purpose. You replaced their silence with self-expression. You became your own source of validation. That evolution makes them nostalgic, not for you as you are now, but for the version of themselves that existed when they were with you. They come back chasing a ghost, the echo of a comfort that no longer exists. You must also understand that your growth will make others uncomfortable. When you move on, you challenge the assumptions they held about you. You were supposed to be predictable, available, forgiving. Instead, you became disciplined, independent, and self-possessed. That transformation forces them to rethink who they are in your absence. Some return not to love you, but to restore their own narrative, to reassert their control. Be vigilant. The test of moving on is not merely emotional strength. It is spiritual discernment. Do not let sympathy masquerade as love or guilt disguise itself as compassion. The most difficult part about all of this is accepting that closure rarely comes from words. It comes from your decision to accept reality as it is, not as you wish it to be. Sometimes the apology never comes. Sometimes the return is hollow. Sometimes the story ends with you forgiving someone silently while walking away permanently. And that is strength too, the kind of strength that frightens those who depend on your weakness to feel powerful. When you move on, You teach them what self-respect looks like in its purest form: calm, detached, and grounded in truth. There's an ancient principle that says, as people must lose the garden before they understand the labor required to maintain it. Love is that garden. It demands attention, pruning, patience, and humility. Many men, intoxicated by pride, walk out of the garden thinking they can find another with less labor. But when they return, they find the gates closed, the soil restored, the flowers blooming without them. They realize, too late, that the beauty they once enjoyed was never accidental. It was cultivated by your effort, your empathy, your consistency. And by the time they understand that, the gardener has already moved on to a new season, no longer waiting for those who couldn't see the worth of what was growing right in front of them. You will find that as you continue to evolve, people from your past will reappear in patterns, not to stay, but to test how far you've come. Life sends them not as opportunities, but as exams. When they return, the universe is asking, have you really healed? Or do you still need the same lesson wrapped in a different form? Your answer lies not in what you say, but in what you choose. Whether you open the door or keep it closed will reveal whether your boundaries were built from pain or from wisdom. So yes, men come back after you move on, not always because they love you, but because they finally see what love required of them and realize too late that they were not ready to give it. Some return to claim, some to redeem, and some merely to remember. But your task is not to decipher their motives. Your task is to remain faithful to your growth, to honor your own transformation, to ensure that your heart remains open to love, but never again available to neglect. For the rarest kind of strength is not in rejecting love, but in requiring that it be built on truth, not nostalgia, on growth, not guilt, on presence, not promises. When he comes back, something in you stirs, not because you still depend on his validation, but because his return echoes the past you once carried so heavily. It reminds you of the nights you questioned your worth, the days you waited for clarity that never came. And yet, standing in front of him now, you realize that the power you hold is different. It's quieter, deeper, rooted not in defiance, but in understanding. You are no longer the person who needs closure because you have already found it in the stillness of your own becoming. The same man who once felt like your entire story is now just a chapter, meaningful, but finished. And that realization shifts everything. There is something almost poetic about how life brings people back when you've outgrown the need for them. It's as if the universe tests your readiness for the next stage of strength by presenting the same lesson in a softer tone. He appears perhaps remorseful, perhaps confused, but always drawn to what you have become. Your peace becomes magnetic because it cannot be bought, and he senses in you a self-assurance that his presence wants to stabilize. He doesn't fully understand it. He only knows that your energy feels different now. It doesn't chase, it doesn't beg, it doesn't plead. It simply is. That stillness makes him restless because it exposes how much chaos he still carries. And this is where discernment matters. When someone returns, you must not listen only to their words, but observe the energy behind them. Words can be rehearsed, but energy never lies. Look at his eyes. Do they hold humility or hunger? Listen to his tone. Is it steady or desperate? Pay attention to his timing. Is he returning because he finally sees your worth, or because life has punished him for failing to honor it before? These questions aren't meant to breed cynicism. They are meant to preserve your sovereignty. Love that lacks discernment quickly becomes enslavement disguised as devotion. You are no longer required to prove your value by being chosen. That was the mistake of your old self, to equate being wanted with being worthy. You know better now. You've learned that true power lies in the ability to walk away from anything that costs you your peace. You've learned that love without respect erodes the soul, and that attention without effort is manipulation, not affection. When he returns, He might say that he misses you, but missing you is not the same as deserving you. Missing you is nostalgia. Deserving you is transformation. Only one of those can sustain a future. When a man realizes that you no longer revolve around him, he faces a mirror he can't escape. He sees a reflection of what he could have been: disciplined, grounded, intentional, but chose not to be. You became that version of yourself alone through your own pain and patience. And now, without saying a word, your presence tells a story. You survived, you healed, you grew. That silent statement is far louder than any speech he could give. And whether he admits it or not, it humbles him. Because nothing unsettles the unhealed like someone who found peace without their apology. There will be moments when you feel empathy, when you look at him and remember the fragments of the person he was before the damage. You'll remember the laughter, the tenderness, the warmth that once felt eternal. But empathy is not the same as regression. You can understand his pain without inviting it back into your home. You can forgive without reopening the door. Forgiveness is freedom for you, not permission for him. It is the quiet act of releasing the weight of the past so it no longer defines your future. Let that be your gift to yourself, not reconciliation, but release. Men come back when they sense that you have reclaimed your identity. It's not magic, it's psychology. You've stopped making them the center of your validation loop, and that destabilizes their sense of control. The same dynamic that once made them feel powerful, your emotional investment, now leaves them feeling invisible. And invisibility is unbearable to the ego. When you no longer respond with urgency, you become unpredictable, and unpredictability forces respect. It forces recognition. They start to see what they once took for granted because they can no longer access it at will. But you must guard against one of the oldest traps of the human heart, the illusion of change. People can talk about growth without embodying it. They can mimic accountability while secretly seeking the same comfort they lost. True growth reveals itself through humility, through patience, through small, consistent behaviors that no longer require you to bleed for balance. Watch what happens after the apology. Watch whether his actions align with his words. Watch whether he seeks to understand you or simply to convince you. Growth is not loud. It's consistent. It shows up in how he handles your boundaries, how he responds when you say no, how he behaves when you no longer make him your priority. If you accept him back, do it from awareness, not from emptiness. Do it because you see evidence of renewal, not because you fear loneliness. Loneliness has a way of making even toxic patterns look like home, but your soul knows better. Your soul recognizes peace, not adrenaline, as love. It recognizes stability, not chaos, as connection. Every time you honor that recognition, you reinforce a new pattern, one where your worth isn't negotiable and your heart isn't a revolving door for people who only remember your value when the word forgets them. The irony of life is that when you stop chasing what is unaligned, everything that belongs to you begins to gravitate toward you. That includes people, opportunities, and peace. Moving on shifts your frequency, not in a mystical way, but in a psychological one. You begin to act from self-respect, and that self-respect reshapes how others treat you. The moment you stopped waiting for him, you sent a message to the universe. I will no longer settle for half-hearted love. That message echoes beyond your imagination. It reorganizes your path. It makes space for what truly matches your growth. And sometimes it makes the wrong ones return, not to stay, but to see that they no longer fit where they once belonged. It's not cruelty that keeps you from reopening old doors. It's wisdom. Because you've learned that love should never require self-abandonment. You've learned that a relationship should feel like partnership, not survival. So when he returns, you measure his presence not by the passion of his words, but by the peace you feel in his company. If your nervous system tenses, if your intuition whispers unease, that is your body remembering what your mind once tried to rationalize away. Trust that. Intuition is not emotion. It's intelligence stored in your soul. He may tell you he's changed, and perhaps he has, but your role is not to be his redemption arc. You are not the reward for his delayed awakening. If he has truly changed, that change will be visible long before he reaches your door. It will be in the way he treats people who cannot benefit him, in the humility with which he confronts his flaws, in the consistency of his actions when no one is watching. Until then, his words are only theory. You require evidence. You have learned too much to build on promises alone. Do not underestimate how powerful your healing has made you. You have walked through heartbreak and come out softer, not bitter. That is rare. That is sacred. To keep that softness alive while enforcing boundaries, that is mastery. It means you can love without losing yourself, give without being drained, and forgive without being deceived. That's what true feminine strength looks like: grace with structure, compassion with discernment, love with standards. That combination terrifies those who depend on chaos to feel significant. So when he returns, and he will, maybe in a message at midnight, maybe in a moment of silence years later, remember that you are no longer obligated to answer from the same version of yourself that loved him. You have evolved. The voice that once trembled now speaks from alignment. The heart that once broke now beats from wholeness. You don't need to prove that you've moved on. Your peace already says it for you. You owe no explanation, no justification, no nostalgia. Sometimes silence is the most powerful language, the one that communicates both grace and closure. People often ask, why do they come back when I've already healed? The answer is simple. Healing shifts your vibration from need to abundance. You no longer emit desperation. You radiate self-respect, and self-respect is rare, magnetic, irresistible to those who lack it. They feel drawn to it because it represents what they secretly crave, but cannot yet create within themselves. But understand, attraction does not equal compatibility. The moth is drawn to the flame, not because the flame needs it, but because the flame represents light. Be the flame, not the trap. Let them learn by observation, not by re-entry. You owe it to yourself to protect the peace you fought to build. That peace was not accidental. It was forged through sleepless nights, through moments of uncertainty, through choosing yourself when it was hardest. Don't trade it for nostalgia. Nostalgia is seductive. It makes the past seem sweeter than it was. It filters out the tears, the waiting, the quiet heartbreaks. But peace is truth. And truth, however quiet, is always better than illusion. When a man truly changes, he won't need to convince you. His energy will speak before his mouth does. His presence will feel calm, grounded, transparent. There will be no guessing games, no confusion, no mixed signals. He will not only say he's ready, he will show it in his consistency, his patience, and his willingness to build at your pace, not his convenience. Until then, let him wrestle with his own reflection. Let him meet the consequences of his absence. Let him grow in the discomfort he once caused. That is not cruelty. That is justice wearing compassion. You are not the same woman who once begged to be understood. You have become the woman who no longer needs to explain her worth. The one who learned that sometimes walking away is not giving up, it's growing up. And when you walk away with peace in your heart, you leave the door of possibility open, but you no longer wait at it. If he is meant to re-enter, he will do so as an equal, not as a rescuer or as a project. You have no room left for half love, no patience for potential that never matures, no tolerance for apologies unaccompanied by effort. The universe has a way of balancing the scales. The same man who made you question your value will someday meet someone who mirrors what he gave you: indifference, neglect, uncertainty. And in that moment, he will understand. But that is not your concern. Your healing has already absolved you of the need for revenge. Your growth is enough proof that pain can be alchemized into wisdom. And that wisdom is your crown, invisible, silent, but unmistakable. So when he returns, remember you are the lesson he wasn't ready to learn. You are the standard life uses to remind him what happens when a man mistakes devotion for permanence. And whether you choose to let him stay or to let him go again, let it be from strength, not from fear. Let it be from love, not for him, but for yourself, for the woman who refused to shrink, who turned heartbreak into clarity, and who finally understood that sometimes the greatest form of closure is peace. And so when you finally release the need to be chosen, you become something far greater than someone waiting. You become someone walking. You walk toward peace, purpose, and self-respect. You no longer live in reaction to someone else's absence or approval. You live in alignment with who you are, and that alignment radiates power. It's the kind of quiet, unshakable power that draws back what once ran away, not because you begged for it,